Good morning, everyone. I think we've all arrived. A warm welcome to Bright Blue's 13th Fringe event of this year's conference. Just in case you haven't yet come across us, Bright Blue is an independent think tank and pressure group for liberal conservatism. Our research focuses on domestic, social, educational, environmental and economic policy, and we'll actually be having a major relaunch later in the autumn, so do keep an eye out for that. We also launched a couple of days ago a new magazine examining the impact of COVID-19 on our family and social lives, and that includes an interview with the Treasury Minister Jessie Norman MP, and you can check that out on our website at brightblue.org.uk. My name's Alexandra Jezeph. I'm a non-exec director and member of the Bright Blue board. And I should probably disclose in my day job, I'm a senior development manager at Transport for London, charged with the delivery of 1,700 new homes in central London. Our topic for the next hour is having healthy homes, and we're delighted to be partnering with Velux and the Town and Country Planning Association for this debate. We are live tweeting the event, so if you're on Twitter, please do use hashtag BrightBlue and hashtag CPC20. And of course, you can follow us on We Are Bright Blue, Velux GBI and the TCPA. And of course, do submit your questions as we go, because we'll take as many as we can in the hour. The onset of COVID-19 was swift, and the resultant lockdown drastically focused our attention on the quality of our lives and the consequent impact on our quality of health and standard of living. And the experience of dealing with the virus was initially referred to as a great leveller, but it has been since acknowledged that living in a tower block or in a house share can materially change the risk of being exposed to the virus. As such, poor quality homes present physical health risks, but there are also mental health implications too. Today's debate will likely touch on a range of themes which are all integral to health and well-being, such as the challenge of housing affordability and accessing quality homes, the imperative to improve building safety, highlighted, of course, by Grenfell, the role of our planning system in driving quality and beauty, and the role of green technology in decarbonising our homes, with the PM announcing later today 160 million of investment to ensure every home in the UK is powered by offshore wind farms within a decade. So as we consider our homes through this lens of health and well-being, we will be asking our panellists to explore some key questions that we've put to them, including: is Britain's housing stock a hazard to human health? What impact will the COVID-19 crisis have on the response of politicians and policymakers towards the quality of people's homes? How should planning laws and building standards change to improve the quality and affordability of housing? What new incentives and investment are needed to decarbonise Britain's housing stock? And what legislation and government reforms are needed to ensure improvement in the quality, not just quantity, of UK homes? That's a lot to cover, and to debate these important questions, we're delighted to be joined by 6 expert speakers. We have Lord Greenhalgh, who is Minister of State for Building Safety and Communities and a former Deputy Mayor for London for Policing and Crime. We have Ben Everitt MP for Milton Keynes North and a member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee. Nicholas Boys-Smith is Founding Director of Create Streets and a member of both the government's Design Review Panel and Estate Regeneration Panel. He was also co-chair of the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. Martina is Senior Property Writer at the Times and Sunday Times. Fiona Howie is Chief Executive of the TCPA, and Neil Freshwater is Public Affairs Manager at Velux. So I'll call you forward in the order that I've mentioned, if you can recall that. Thank you very much to you all for joining us. We've got 4 or 5 minutes for each speaker, so I'll invite Stephen to open up the conversation. Stephen.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. Great to join you all here. I'd say I was plucked not once but twice from political retirement by the then Mayor Boris Johnson and the current Prime Minister to get back into politics. But my background actually is, before being Deputy Mayor for Policing in City Hall, I was 16 years a local councillor and leader of a council in a very urban environment, stretching from the genteel parts of Fulham to the borders of Brent. That's taking us through Shepherd's Bush and White City. So a lot of my views are driven by my experience as a local councillor. look, all governments focus on numbers and the drive for volume. And in fact, one of my two bosses, I'm also Fire Minister in the Home Office, has already committed to build 1 million new homes. And there's inevitably a desire that we have enough homes for the growing population. We've seen the population grow exponentially really over the last decade. And so that commitment to build is absolutely right. But I think it's also right that we focus on the drive for quality. Well, your question is a good question. I can do the easy bit first, and then I want to make a couple of points, and that'll be it. I mean, firstly, our current housing stock is not a hazard to life. There are only fewer than 200 fatalities in dwellings in the last recorded year. That's an all-time low. And the number of homes that are categorised as Category 1 serious hazard homes fell from 22% over a decade ago to half of that figure, 11% in 2018. But the issue around health, I think, has been, and well-being, has been brought into focus by the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's quite clear that in New York, Manhattan was not as hard hit as the Bronx, and Brent was hit harder than Belgravia. And that is obviously, a lot more research needs to be done, but we can probably assume that there's greater overcrowding in Brent than in Belgravia, and also the people there have probably more underlying conditions, and that will be a greater area of deprivation than Belgravia. Now, I think there are three factors we need to consider. We mustn't forget the drive for numbers. So I think physical is important, and we need to be prepared to have denser homes. And of course, the Victorians built lovely homes that are extremely dense, twice the density of a typical terrace street that I'm in at the moment in Fulham. Those mansion blocks are about 800 habitable rooms per hectare. That's the first place that my parents bought when they moved to Fulham, when my dad was a medical student, just around the corner. Lovely, beautiful homes. A little hard when you've got to push a pram up 4 flights of stairs, but still a great start for my parents to get on the property ladder. So density, I think, is important. I think safety is important. And frankly, somehow between the Victorian era, with our pattern books and a process approach to construction, we seem to sort of throw it all together. And there have been some really poorly built homes in the latter half of the 20th century. So I think we need to ensure that we have safer homes, as well as beautiful homes. And Nick Boy-Smith will wax lyrical about what is beautiful. I'm not very good at that sort of thing. But I want us to think about two other factors, one of which is addressed by the government, and the other one I think we need to focus on as well. We obviously need sustainable homes, and that commitment to our future home standards and how we decarbonise is incredibly important. But I want you to think about a third pillar, which is you can have all of those things right around the physical, all of those things right around sustainability, and still have mental health problems. And that's if you don't follow the principles around mixed communities. And I can give you the tale of two estates. One estate where we put all our most problematic tenants in one place, and we had significant problems, and another estate across the road that is very high levels of right to buy and functions very, very well. So we do need to think about not warehousing poverty, quite frankly. So that social dimension is incredibly important. Now, the government is doing a lot. Obviously, everyone will say it could do more. I'm taking through the Building Safety Bill. It was introduced in the Commons. No, it was published, not introduced. It's not been introduced yet. I'm running ahead of myself. It's been published and going through pre-legislative scrutiny in the Commons, and that creates a building safety regulator, so we don't suffer the tragedy of something like a Grenfell ever again in our high-rises, many of which have been built very poorly, because there's been a complete wholesale failure in many respects that has led to that, and we need to make sure that never happens again. We've obviously created the New Homes Ombudsman with greater powers. And I think a testament to Nick Boy-Smith and Create Streets. I've been following Nick's career since, there was a time, I think you were in Hammersmith and Fulham, Nick, but the National Design Guide is testament to try and get back to the beauty that we see in Bath, the Georgian splendour. The Victorians were great builders. The Edwardians built out a lot of the suburbs. And I think, it's great to have a National Design Guide that tries to capture some of the characteristics of well-designed places. But I think my first plea as the Building Safety Minister, so I'm kind of put myself out of a job and I can eventually retire from public life, is that the construction industry needs to raise its game. Why can't we think about a process by which we build buildings and make it easier to do that? So let's pioneer design for manufacture and assembly so that it's like putting a Meccano kit together and you know that all the parts that you use are safe, as opposed to trying to make it up as though we've never built a building before. Obviously, there's non-volumetric and volumetric modular construction, but I think the way we build our buildings will help us build buildings that are great places. And obviously we need to ensure that there's enough amenity and all those good things. But, I think it's a great topic to start this fringe, thinking about quality and not just volume.
Thanks for kicking off with a very positive start to that conversation, Stephen, covering off density, safety, sustainability, but not forgetting that social dimension. Ben, can I call upon you next?
Well, thank you very much, Alexandra. I think just to really pick up where Stephen left off, it's when we talk about our housing stock and in relation to human health, the really important thing that we have realised over this the pandemic is that it's not just our physical health; it is also our mental health, and we really value the amenities that we have. We really value the ability to go outside. If we were locked down forever, we would have very, very, very different lives. So having housing stock that is well associated with green spaces. So not just on green spaces, but green spaces accessible is so important just to healthy populations, to healthy minds as well. That said, we know that 1 in 5 homes currently does not meet what is referred to as decent home standard. Now that doesn't mean that they are necessarily a hazard to health. But it does mean that those high standards that we set ourselves aren't being met for 20% of homes in the UK. And that, frankly, is not good enough. So we do need to make sure that we are constantly moving that bar. We have high standards for ourselves. It's really, really important just to make sure that we get this right purely, not just for the health and well-being of our nation, but also for the benefits to our public finances. We have the Building Research Establishment has shown that £1.5 billion a year of costs to the NHS could be avoided by better quality housing. I mean, that's absolutely staggering. Poor housing is costing us £1.5 billion in terms of the cost to the NHS. So what do we do about this? Well, obviously we've got the Building Safety Bill going through Parliament at the moment, and as Stephen's mentioned, it is in response to Grenfell, but it is also one of those turning points in the legislative agenda where we can actually seize the initiative and make homes better. So as well as the aesthetics, we look at the process of living in a house, actually being a family, growing up in a house, and making sure that it is healthy for us. And then we've got the planning reforms, the biggest reforms in a generation, biggest reforms in possibly 70 years. And a huge part of that is about design. Again, Nicholas is going to talk about design, I'm sure. But part of living in a healthy home is making sure that we get that design right at a local level, so that aesthetically it meets with the local environment, but also so that we have those quality standards within our homes. So a hugely important period in history at the moment, not just because we're bouncing back from a pandemic, but because we have the opportunity to shape the design of the places that we live in for the future.
Many thanks, Ben, and that works well to pass straight over to Nicholas, who may well want to pick up on some of those planning reforms and design comments.
Thank you. Hang on, just go off mute. The line from 2020. Thank you very much. I will just say, I think 4 or 5 things. I'm a bit nervous because Stephen said I was going to wax lyrical. I'm not sure I'm going to quite rise to that. Just on the first question, are our homes a threat to our health? No, the vast majority aren't. I think, however, I think it's also true that the vast majority of the homes we live in and the places we live in are not maximising the impact they could have on our physical and mental health. An American meta-study suggested that about 40% of our health outcomes are a function of where and how we live, as opposed to who we are. So we are all individuals. We all have our own DNA, and we've all got our own choices we make about what we eat and what we smoke. But they are very influenced by the lives we lead and where we lead them. I think it's probably most helpful to think of it at 4 levels. So that the first level is your physical home. Is it big enough? Is it noisy? Is it clean? Are there damp problems? So there's a sort of physical impact on your health there. There's a second impact, which is sort of social stressors. So fear of overcrowding, sense of overcrowding, fear of crime. There's a link to that is perhaps mastery of your own environment. People who don't feel they can control their own environment, perhaps because they're short-term renters, perhaps because they're nervous about their own job situations, feel less comfortable and happy in their own place, even when other things are equal. I think there's then a third level, and this is perhaps one that Create Streets works on the most, which is the environment around your home. So Ben, you mentioned green space, which is important, but green space is not a panacea. It's more, as obviously you recognise, Ben, it's much more complex than that. So, having a safe network of walkable streets through which you can get to, the train station, the shops, your children's school, to your parents, somewhere where you can feel that you can move around easily, clean air to breathe, very much influenced by things like street trees and out of traffic, human scale enclosure, facades which have some level of variety in a pattern, some sense of place, some sense of coherence, but also of complexity. All these things have discoverable consequences and correlations with how happy we feel, how much we walk, how many of our neighbours we know. So, a clear block pattern, for example, with very clear backs and fronts, where you've got safely private gardens or well overlooked public spaces, is correlated with greater use of green spaces, particularly for children. And Stephen, you mentioned Victorian towns. Sorry, my lord, I should say. Yes, I mean, actually, for generations across cities, we've been sort of broadly getting this right. And about 60, 70 years ago, a range of things sort of got us all a bit confused. We invented the car, which is a marvellous thing, the car, but we got confused that cars should exist in the middle of towns and cities. And they have a role, but they don't need to dominate it. Humans need to come first. We learned technically how to build enormous cheap sheds very cheaply, and we possibly rejected some of the organic learnings from towns and cities over millennia in an understandable desire to reject the past immediately post-war. So I think that those are sort of key levels in which our homes and the places around them affect our health. That's perhaps the first point I'd make. The second question you've asked is what decision making? How was it? What impact will COVID-19 crisis have on the response of politicians towards the quality of people's homes? Well, I mean, I think the point's already been made that I think we've all relearnt the importance of our home and our built environments in our physical and mental health. I don't know what impact it'll have on political decision making. The big question that's up there is, will the changes we've seen and are still seeing, how long lasting will they be and how permanent will they be? So we're seeing a really clear distinction in the speed of the bounce back in town and city centres versus local centres and smaller towns and villages. People are not going into town centres for obvious reasons. We've all learnt that we can do things like this, have Zoom meetings. We've also, I think most of us learnt, we can't do all things like this. To hire someone to forge a meaningful relationship with a work peer it's very hard, I think, in reality, to do over a screen. So to what degree are towns and city centres going to bounce back, and to what degree will we actually lead slightly more physically dislocated lives with a greater reliance on local centres? I don't think we know the answer to that. I mean, there's definitely a shift happening, but how far it will go is unclear. So that, I think, is the big uncertainty linked with issues on public transport, which I won't go into now. One of the other questions you've asked, Alexandra, is how should planning laws and building standards change to improve the quality and the affordability of housing? Well, and I think the point I'd make is there's always been a role for the state in the regulation of the built environment. I mean, literally, if you go back as far as we have evidence of cities, right back to the Indus Valley and the Sumerians, there's evidence of clearly a guiding authority impacting build quality and block structure. So this is something that the state, or at any rate the city-state, has always done. And there are good reasons for that. If I own House A and you, Ben, own House B, and I put thatch on my roof and it burns down, that's probably going to affect you as well. So it's just something city-states get pulled into doing. But what we've got confused about, I think, over the last generation or so, is we've got confused about the role of planning and the role of regulation. And we've put into planning things that should just be regulatory. And so certainly there always used to be regulatory. So if you look at the 18th or 19th century building acts or the public health acts of the late 19th century, lots of things that we now put in the planning system were essentially in the regulatory system as was then. And those include fundamental impacts on the lives we lead, the size of our homes, and the connectedness and the meaningfulness of the lives that we can lead in them and in the places that they create. So I think there's a shift back to that, and that's just to perhaps come on to my penultimate point. Is I think what we're seeing, I think helpfully in the planning white paper, as you mentioned, Alexandra, I chaired last year, or co-chaired with the late lamented Roger Scruton, the government's Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission. I see that it says on the screen I'm still chair of it. It doesn't exist. I'm not. I was, but we came up with 4 key themes, several of which have been picked up, I think, well in the white paper. The first was bringing forward the democracy of planning. So it ceases to be a case-by-case basis and creating a more level playing field. So re-energizing the role and the way in which communities can meaningfully influence the local plan, because that is completely broken at the moment. I won't go into more detail on that. I'm happy to take that more in questions. That's been picked up in the white paper. What not surprisingly hasn't been picked up in the white paper, because it's not a planning matter, is the theme that we called stewardship and incentivizing responsibility to the future. And that's is the way in which the tax system is currently incentivizing land sale processes. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on that now, but at the moment it essentially incentivizes landowners to sell as quickly as possible rather than taking a long-term view of what happens to their land. And that is leading to clearly to suboptimal outcomes and to sort of dump boxes in a field form of city expansion. The third key theme was about allowing or helping towns and cities and places outside some of the more prosperous parts of England to rediscover their purpose as towns and as centres, as places that people go to meaningfully and agreeably mart with their fellow men and women. And if you go, sadly, into many town centres, they have lost that purpose. So we've got to allow towns to rediscover themselves. I think that goes right to the heart of the government's levelling up agenda. And then the final point we made, and this is absolutely key, is that the interventions the state makes in the land market, and we're making very big ones right now, perhaps bigger than for a generation, via Homes England, have got to be leading to the right outcomes. I'm afraid at the moment they're just not. So the KPIs, the processes we're going through, the decisions being made on land sales, they're getting better actually in the last couple of years, but are absolutely leading to suboptimal outcomes. So, lots of good stuff happening, but I think a lot more to go if we're going to lead to the types of place that are more popular, more sustainable, and better linked to the evidence on high physical and mental well-being. And then just the final point on energy efficiency, which I haven't touched on, and then I promise I'll shush. I just make a plea for 2 things which sometimes get lost in the debate about sustainability in homes. The first is the crucial importance of recycling buildings, actually. There is so much embedded carbon in existing buildings. The amount of embedding carbon in a typical Victorian semi-detached house would take a car about 10 times around the world. So where we can reuse buildings rather than pulling them down and starting again, we should do that. And then the second point I'd make is, if you put the most perfect passive house, e-house, everything else, all bells and whistles, in the middle of nowhere, because you have to drive there, you are not creating an environmentally friendly house. You're just creating an energy efficiency house and a non-energy efficient lifestyle. So it isn't just the physical fabric of the house, it's the physical fabric of the place around the house that we create or that we sustain. And that it's too easy for the environmental debate to get waylaid into sort of the bells and whistles and the stuff that someone sells you, rather than the actual lifestyle we lead around it. And again, I think there's good progress on that, but that for me is the real bite. I'll stop there. I hope that was interesting.
Thank you very much, Nick. You've covered a huge amount there. I'm going to go straight to Martina, but first mention that actually Slido isn't working. So if you'd like to submit your questions, please do it on Twitter using the hashtag #BrightBlue, and the team will pick that up and send it through. Martina.
Thanks, Alexandra. Yes, we need to build more homes and better homes and more beautiful homes, but we must also fix the 29 million homes we already have. And I want to talk about 2 ways in which those homes are not healthy enough. First, too many of them are unsafe. When Greenhalgh happened, that showed us that we cannot trust our building regulations, and it exposed a culture of shoddy work, which Stephen touched on. Now we know that about 200,000 high-rise flats are still wrapped in flammable materials. And we also have up to 1.5 million flats that could be unmortgageable for years. That's 6% of homes in England. So lenders now want proof that almost any flat is safe, even in 3-story blocks with no cladding. And so far, 9 in 10 blocks have failed those checks. Then they must be fixed, and that can take 5 to 10 years. Under leasehold law, the innocent people who bought those homes have to pay to fix it, and which can cost typically £30,000 and as much as £115,000 per flat in one block. And that's half of what those people paid for those flats. The government has set aside £1.6 billion to fix this, but experts think that will cover only about a fifth of the high-rise blocks affected, and it won't cover any medium-rise ones, despite at least 5 fires in blocks like that since Greenhalgh. Now, more and more flats are becoming unmortgageable because their blocks can't get a safety check, and if they can, they probably fail it. The human cost is immense. The people who put their life savings into these flats can't sell, they can't move jobs, they can't get married, they can't afford to have children, they can't retire. So the Sunday Times have launched a campaign to end this hidden housing scandal. And in response, we've had our biggest mailbag ever on one issue. Hundreds of people have written in. Some are caught up in the crisis, but many are just ordinary people who have only now woken up to the huge repercussions of this issue. The government has not grasped the nettle properly. If this carries on, the building safety crisis will hit the whole housing market. It's already causing sales chains to collapse. Even the boss of UK Finance recently lost his own property sale because his chain collapsed over a flat at the bottom of the chain. If this breaks the first rung of the housing ladder, it will hit house builders and house prices. And compounded by COVID, it could hit the economy at the worst possible time. That brings me to the second crisis that has nowhere near the attention it needs in our homes, and that's the climate crisis. Our homes account for about a fifth of the carbon Britain emits. In the last 20 years, the carbon from homes have dropped by just 14%. And that's mostly because we make more of our electricity from water, wind, and the sun. In the next 30 years, we have to get all the way down to zero. Hitting net zero by 2050 would give the world half a chance of avoiding a dangerous rise in temperatures, says the UN. Today, the PM will promise £160 million to double Britain's wind energy capacity in a decade. That could make every home's electricity green by 2030, he says, but not their heating. We would still be stuck with gas boilers in about 25 million homes. To switch to heat pumps, we have to insulate homes much better, or the heat pumps won't work. Britain's homes are among the draftiest in Europe. The new £2 billion Green Homes grant could help insulate about 600,000 homes, the government says, but to upgrade every home to its full energy efficiency capacity would cost about £300 billion, Saville says. That's as much as HS2 and the COVID stimulus so far put together. Not all of that has to come from taxpayers. Full upgrades would increase the value of our homes by £360 billion, so it could eventually pay for itself. But we do need to kickstart it. As David Attenborough says in Extinction, his new documentary, now is the time for a green recovery. Yet as we rush to insulate our homes and to build more and more beautiful ones, let's learn from the building safety crisis and get this right. We should not be coating our walls in petrol byproducts, and we should not dilute rules to allow poor quality homes, and we should not leave innocent people to pay for the mistakes of the rule makers, the builders, the designers, and the inspectors in decades to come.
Thank you very much, Martina, there, sort of covering the green recovery and obviously highlighting this real issue around the cladding and the process that people are trying to go through to get their homes mortgaged on with that challenge. Moving swiftly on, we'll invite Fiona and then Neil to speak. I'm conscious of time, so without further ado, Fiona.
Thank you very much. So I know other speakers have talked about the links between obviously the quality of homes and people's health and well-being, The TCPA is clear that there are profound links between housing and health and well-being. And I know COVID has brought that to the fore for many people, but we've known about those links for decades. I know Nicholas mentioned that the vast majority of our homes aren't a hazard to life, and that's true, but that's why this is such a social justice issue. So, for example, across England, children living in substandard housing face up to a 25% higher risk of severe ill health and disability during childhood and early adulthood, as well as lower educational attainment and a greater likelihood of unemployment and poverty. So yes, lots of us live in relatively good or very good quality homes, but too many people are suffering. I know Ben mentioned the cost to the NHS. We know that substandard housing increases the likelihood of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. Also, I know I'm really pleased that other speakers have touched on the importance of the neighbourhood that those homes are in, because again, there's a crucial importance between mental and physical well-being. Again, we knew about these before COVID. I hope that COVID will have highlighted it for many and that therefore we'll be able to make the changes that we think are necessary. But those neighbourhoods that discourage walking and have poor cycling infrastructure can have negative impacts on residents' mental well-being, which I know has been touched on, but also increase the risk of type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular diseases. This is really important and we need to make sure that we get this right. So I know, again, people have talked about the importance of more houses, and I know there's been sort of messaging around quality and quantity, which absolutely we need more homes, but surely they should all be of a decent standard. In too many places, we've seen that there's been no emphasis on placemaking and that people just aren't thinking about the need for positive outcomes for people from what's being built. So I would highlight briefly is around that this is partly due to deregulation and particularly in the form of permitted development rights. But it's not just that. We've also seen work by the Place Alliance that highlighted large-scale housing-led schemes getting planning permission aren't of high enough quality either. So I know there are various things going on. There's the building safety bill's been mentioned, the planning reforms have been mentioned, and absolutely that messaging, that aspiration for improving quality and improving placemaking is very positive. But what we're concerned about is that the system is too fragmented. As Nicholas said, historically there's been building regulations and there's been planning and there's been housing policy. But actually all of those are important and all of those are what we need to bring together and make the changes that we believe are needed. So for example, at the moment, just to talk a bit more about that fragmentation, through secondary legislation, people might be aware the government has introduced new standards for natural light and has recently committed to introducing space standards, which we hope will come forward shortly. But those are for homes coming through permitted development rights, but won't apply to homes getting planning permission. And so the homes coming via PD really highlighted that actually there were gaps. There was some stuff in building regs, there was some stuff in planning policy, but actually that didn't apply to PD. But things like the need for windows just didn't exist in regulation. And so that's why we're worried that this fragmentation has resulted in some of these problems. We also would highlight, we know that there's lots of really positive language which we welcome in the planning white paper around quality, placemaking, improving home quality. Sorry, my cat's now. Which again, we really do welcome, but our concern is that as we understand it, that the quality of outcomes from those changes will really depend on the contents of local design guides. Now, we recognise the importance of local design guides, and that could be really positive in the system, but what we're worried about is there will still be variety and a lack of consistency between neighbourhoods. So what we think we need is a baseline, so to ensure that everybody has a decent home, or all new homes coming through the system are of a decent enough quality. And so we raise that baseline, which is why we believe that there's a need for new primary legislation in the form of a healthy homes bill, we're calling it, which would secure the transformation in quality of homes and places that's necessary. I won't go into all of the detail because of lack of time, but the principles relate to some issues which would traditionally sit in building regs and indeed do, such as safety from risk of fire, need for homes to be accessible and adaptable. But we also, some of the principles relate to radical reductions in carbon, to pick up on Martina's points, We've also drawn on lots of work that we've done in the past around reuniting planning and health, and so that importance of place, which I know other speakers have talked about. So some of the principles relate to the need to be homes to be within walkable neighbourhoods and have access to green and play space. The principles are purposefully high level in the bill that we've drafted, and part of the mechanism for implementation would be the Secretary of State develops a policy statement about how they would be defined and implemented. So actually the principles would then be translated into a set of minimum standards. We would expect that they would be implemented through changes to building regs and policy. But having the principles together in one place, we believe gives them coherence within the current system, and also that clarity and certainty for the sector and for future residents. It would also create a Healthy Homes Commissioner to ensure promotion and implementation of the principles, to actually ensure that they've got some teeth within the system, because that's again part of our concern. As highlighted earlier, we know in planning permission that aren't a good enough quality, and so again we believe that more change is needed. So I just highlight very, very finally, we do think that in the short term and within the reform system, there's a welcome emphasis on quality as well as quantity. We need to see that really taken through the system, because we're concerned that it's not always reflected in some of the actions, including the recent expansion of permitted development rights. But surely we do need a basic minimum standard for all new homes to make sure that they support people's health, well-being and life chances. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Fiona. Many comments there. Neil, I'm going to challenge you to deliver yours as fast as possible. We're so short on time, but over to you. Sorry, Neil, you're on mute.
The first one that's managed to do that. Great.
No worries.
Thanks very much, Alex. So yeah, I was just going to pick up on a couple of the points that were raised. I think mainly reiterating a lot of what has been said already. So our business, Velux, was founded about 80 years ago with the very principle of creating better living environments. So healthy homes is very much in our DNA. But to answer the first question around, is Britain's housing stock a hazard to human health, I would probably reiterate and say yes, I think to some extent. For the past 5 years, we've been producing the annual Healthy Homes Barometer. And we work with a research partner to look at take a snapshot of the healthiness or the unhealthiness of Britain's housing stock. And as has been touched on before, our figures find that, there are around 2.5 million houses with damp conditions, 1 million with insufficient daylight, around 3/4 that have inadequate heating, 750,000 with inadequate heating, and around 2 million with excessive noise pollution. So there is certainly evidence, and by all means not all houses, but there is evidence that some properties are potentially unhealthy and have hazards which could potentially impact on human health. So this leads to the next point, what are the minimum requirements for a healthy home? So I think some of the parameters that I've talked about, darkness, lack of daylight, lack of warm temperature, could be used to identify maybe what is an unhealthy home. But I think this is perhaps a bare minimum. And I think, as Nicholas touched on earlier, we maybe need to be looking more about how we can optimize health, both for the occupants and for that of the planet, rather than just setting minimum standards. So I think in reality, I'd suggest this means taking a much more holistic approach to both design of new build and retrofit that considers both health and well-being alongside the very important decarbonising of our property stock. And this, I think, is both an opportunity in terms of when we're retrofitting and improving our properties, but also against mitigating against unintended consequences. At a basic level, for example, this might be ensuring that when you're retrofitting insulation to a property, and Martina touched on this earlier, and making it more airtight to insulate it, you also consider how the building is properly ventilated, so you don't create new problems there. So again, it's about this holistic approach and considering the entire envelope and building physics. And indeed, much of these aspects, I think, are in terms of optimizing health, are covered in the TCPA's Healthy Homes draft bill, which Fiona has just touched on. And we think it's an excellent initiative, and why we're very keen to support it. There's been much discussion about where standards for health and well-being within buildings should sit. Is it in building regs? Is it in planning? Or is it in a separate design guide? But I think the first thing is the fundamental principles of what we're trying to achieve. And I think the draft Healthy Homes bill sets that out. One final plug is that the Velux is a co-sponsor of the all-party group on healthy homes, and this group recently published its white paper on healthy homes and buildings, and the APPG has been in conversation with the TCPA for some time to align where possible the asks within the white paper with those in the TCPA's draft Healthy Homes Bill. One of the other asks in the white paper, and I think there's a parallel to this to the Healthy Homes Commissioner point that Fiona just touched on, is the need for cross-departmental governance of healthy homes within the UK government, because it cuts across so many different departments, MHCLG for housing, BEIS in terms of energy efficiency, and of course the Department of Health. I'm obviously very encouraged to hear the comments the Minister has been talking about, but I think in terms of delivery, there really does need to be this cross-governance. So I think a couple of positive notes, again, these have been touched on. I think the work of the Building Better Commission, which Nicholas has touched on, is fantastic, and our Director of Architecture, Lona Pfeiffer, was very supportive of that. And I think that's a real positive thing, particularly with the planning reforms that are coming through. I think that'll act as a bedrock to keep the plans on check, hopefully, and bring out those things of quality and good design. And obviously, as was touched on as well, last week there was the announcement of the minimum space standards for permitted development, and I think that's a really a small but very positive step, because obviously it makes sure that there is adequate light. And as Fiona touched on, sometimes there was cases where there were no requirements for windows. So I think in concluding, I'd probably just pick up to sort of three takeaway points. Firstly, I think we need a holistic approach to decarbonising and healthy buildings. Secondly, I think we need cross-departmental governance within the UK government to deny this, to deliver this. And finally, I would just say to the parliamentarians with us today to get behind and support the TCPA's Healthy Homes Bill campaign. Thanks very much.
Neil, thank you very much. Good to your words. That was high speed, but covered a lot there. Thank you to all our panelists for your comments. I'll go straight to questions, and I'll take them in groups because we have got a few and not very long to get through them. So Shane Hansen asked, Britain's housing stock appears to be of less quality than many of our European neighbours. Will the government's planning reforms only make this work? Neil, just touching on some of the building regs and permitted development rights points that you said there. Maybe you could come back on that one. And another one that's come through is, what are the best ways to incentivise builders to incorporate green standards into new housing projects? And I think that links neatly to some of the sort of regulation and standards that we've been referencing right the way across this panel. Perhaps Stephen or anyone else, please jump in on those. Anyone would like to start?
Can I just...
and then we'll go to Neil.
And then, just on planning, I think I think the TCPA would agree. We're up for needing to reform the planning system. It's not been looked at in about 7 decades. I think it was a post-war act. I think the principles of getting democracy up front is embraced in the sense that typically everything was argued right at the end of the planning process rather than framing a plan for an area. And I know that, having been a council leader for 6 years. So I think the principles about front-loading democracy, trying to get more pre-approved planning, but having a strong throat, if you like, around quality, those are good principles. Now, of course, we're at a white paper stage and there needs to be more bashing out. And I was interested in Nick's point about getting what you need in regulations and getting planning principles in planning. But I think we're taking the right steps on that. Can I just come back to Martina? Because I know through leasehold groups that you're doing a great job raising this issue. And I've come into government. I'm just a newly minted minister 6 months into the job. And you're right, this is a crisis. Some describe it as a scandal, and I think that's fair. But I wouldn't say this is a scandal that we can squarely lay at anyone's door. It's a system failure. It's a system failure in regulatory terms from top to bottom. And we can't even say where you would want to put the blame, but we saw in the Grenfell inquiry, we need a fundamental professionalisation of building control and being able to have much greater knowledge about design and construction to sign things off as safe. We've seen construction cutting corners from despicable practices. through the Grenfell inquiry, and the drive for profit over safety. Now, all of that takes government some time, and I think it's pretty brave of a government to put up 1.6 billion front up to remove cladding. I think it's pretty brave to come up with the reforms around creating a building safety regulator that will be in the Health and Safety Executive. Now, you're right that for leaseholders, there's some considerable market failure issues in response to the significant crisis, and we're going to come forward with more measures. But you need to be patient, because this is going to require a response that's very thought through and considered. Leasehold law is extremely complex, and I've taken over leaseholders' responsibility because I thought I didn't have enough to do. And actually, as a tenure, that does require positive reform. But just watch this space. We're going to come up with more measures to deal with this, but this is not an easy one to say that there's a quick solution. And I don't think it's fair to say that this government hasn't grasped the nettle. It is grasping the nettle, and it will do more to grasp it even more in the future.
Lovely. Neil, and then perhaps Martina, if you wanted to come back on any points.
Yeah, thanks. So I think the point was asking is, why is Britain's housing stock worse than anywhere else in Europe? I'll just make 2 points or 2 observations on that. I think the first one is that Velux is a Danish company, and often when I talk to my colleagues across the water, they're often surprised at how we build houses differently here. I think a huge number of houses in Britain are built by just a small handful of house builders, whereas in sort of mainland Europe, you often find that houses are perhaps there's a lot more input from the individual builder or the individual homeowner when they actually build their house. So there might be some issues there. And I think the second potential issue is because over many years we've had such a sort of supply and demand issue that it's very much been a seller's market. Therefore, I think issues around quality, around energy efficiency, and so on are potentially not the priority of buyers, simply because it's been so difficult to get on the housing ladder over the last few years. I don't know if those are that's all the reasons are, but I would offer those as 2 sort of observations as to why the housing stock in Britain might be different from other parts of Europe.
Thanks, Neil. I think, Fiona, you wanted to make a comment there. I'm sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, yes, just briefly wanted to pick up on the comments about planning reforms, because it's something we've obviously commented on quite a lot. I think absolutely the TCPA agrees that we need to reform the planning system. We absolutely recognise it can be and should be improved. I think one of our concerns about the proposed reform is that we do want more people to engage with local plan processes. We want people to feed in at that process, but we're concerned that the one actual legal right for citizens to be involved in the examination and process it's proposed that will be altered so that people don't have a right to be heard in person. So what we're worried about is absolutely let's engage people in planning. That's really positive. Let's make it more accessible, but that's not necessarily the same as making it more democratic.
Thank you. I am going to throw another question into the mix and then actually go to Nick, who I think wanted to come back on another point as well. And that was Fiona Jones has said, a beautifully built community will still have issues if it is poorly connected. Does the panel think that the government is spending enough time considering how to connect remote communities? Whilst we digest that question, Nick, did you want to come back on another point from earlier in the conversation?
I'll just quickly say something in response to Neil. I think he makes a good point. I'd just like to underline it because I think it's incredibly important. We have a very, very curious planning system in historical comparative terms, which, as Stephen was touching on, backloads the process. It's a tactical process where the clarity of what is buildable is very uncertain. That is very, very important in increasing planning risk. Because all the money you spend, if you own land or if you wish to develop something, before you get planning permission, can literally go up in smoke if you don't get it. And that makes it much harder to finance innovation. It makes it much harder to finance market entrance. And it means that, as happens in whenever you have a crisis, small firms, firms go bust. But they normally bounce back in most cycles. That doesn't happen in this country with anything like the vigor that it should do, because the barriers of entry, particularly as prices just go up and up as we ratchet the undersupply of homes over the last 2 generations, just means you can't enter the market. And the consequence is we have, by any measure, the most concentrated market in the Western world. You can look to the left, you can look to the right, and we also have the market in which it's hardest to innovate. The British are an entrepreneurial people. There is a reason why modern housing has been so struggling to take off in this country. That's because a new technique is a high risk thing to do, particularly a factory based technique where you need to invest a lot up front. So we've got to fix this. And I think to the white paper's credit, it is taking important steps to do that. So that's just, that's why we have problems, is that we have an overly concentrated market where the big boys are not competed with enough. That's not to criticise the big boys; they just need more competition. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
So we had this question on connecting in with remote communities. Ben, Martina, did you want to comment on either that point or some of the other comments that have come back in the conversation? Ben?
Well, thank you. Really, there's 5 things that this government set out to do, which have been somewhat interrupted by the pandemic. But you will know the first 3. It's 40 new hospitals. It's 20,000 extra police officers. It is 50,000 nurses. Gosh, I should know that by now. But the other 2, which are equally important, are levelling up and net zero. And the truth is that we can't do levelling up and we can't do net zero without building the right kind of houses in the right places at the right time, at the right speed, and at the right quality with the right infrastructure. So the question about remote communities has to be seen through that lens of both levelling up, but also the net zero, getting the right amount of modular builds in, and using building materials in a way that is more sustainable, and also making sure that we have energy efficient houses. That needs joined up thinking with infrastructure, but also with the grid, and also with our local economies. We need to make sure that when we stimulate sustainable organic local growth as part of the levelling up agenda, we're doing so with the right kind of quality housing in the right places, connected by the right infrastructure. So you really, really need to zoom right up, look at the longer term goals that this government has, and see it through that housing lens.
Thanks very much, Ben. Martina.
Lord Greenhalgh, thank you for your response earlier. I am really glad to hear that there's an understanding of the immense scope of this problem of our building safety, and that you are really addressing it. I think the reason why I said the government so far hasn't grasped the nettle properly is that the response up until very recently was bit by bit, and it seemed reluctant. And I think you're right, this is a huge systemic issue, but only the government is big enough to deal with it properly. So one of the things that has happened now is that many buildings that are low risk are being caught up in this, and people living in them can't move on with their lives. And we need to address this by risk and not overreact to the degree that many people's lives are put on hold without them actually being unsafe. And that is going to be the case for years unless you are able to step in and help. So that's one thing I'd really like to see.
Alexandra, can I come back at that?
Absolutely.
Martina, of course, if I were a journalist covering this, that's what I would say. I'm also a human being. When I came in, and that's the first thing I said, let's think about risk and get a proportionate approach to risk. As I mentioned, I'm also the fire minister. There were less than 200 people that died in dwellings because of fire in the last year. That's the lowest on record, by the way, since the series began. So the first thing to say is we do need to be proportionate. The market needs to be proportionate about this. The difficulty is when I asked, well, how do we then approach risk stratification? I was given at least 42 different ways of doing it. And we are trying to develop that, but it takes time. It needs to be professionally led. It can't be government that says, well, let's take this approach. That's what's right. Without a lot of thought and consultation, and we're getting a lot of input from building safety professionals, but also the fire professionals that are looking into this, the fire engineers, the fire safety professionals that know a lot about this. And of course, we're going to take an approach to risk, but there's no doubt that there is greater risk in a high-rise building above 18 metres. There's no doubt that there's a lot of evidence on this that was presented in the Hackett report. But I absolutely agree with you. We do need to take a proportionate approach and think about risk in the round. But that's easier said than done.
Thanks very much for that, Stephen. So I'll chance my luck with one more question in the time available. Jen Bear has asked a slightly different angle on the conversation. With more people choosing to be child-free, with smaller homes, will smaller homes become more common? Most developments build mainly 3-bed plus, but you could get 1 or 2-bed homes in that space. Not all single or childless people want to live in flats, so smaller homes would be good. So I think really the thrust of that is, are we building the right type of homes for our needs? Would anyone like to come back on that? Ben, I think you're nodding there.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. It's we are blessed with quite a quality problem in that it's not just people choosing to be child free, but we have a greater number of people than ever before who are living longer, happier, healthier, wealthier, more independent lives, and taking up housing space where actually we have a need for sort of 1, 2-bedroomed houses, potentially bungalows, so that people can actually move out of the larger houses they're occupying in their older years, as well as the need for the younger people who choose to be childless. And that stock simply isn't there. And where it is there, we currently have a system which with stamp duty, which sort of penalises people for downsizing and making that move to the smaller house and freeing up the space. So as well as the stock that needs to be built, we need to look at what incentives that we have through the taxation system and also through our future model for social care to incentivise people to be much more mobile between types of houses in their later years as well as throughout their lives.
Thanks very much, Ben. I'm going to indulge in one last question. It's going to be a challenge because we've got 1 minute left. Could you each give me your, in a pithy one sentence, your policy that you think is the priority here? We've had so much that we've covered. What would you advocate for? Nick?
Trust the people for what we create and where we create it.
Very succinct. Thank you, Nick. Fiona?
Sorry, was that me?
Neil first, and then we'll go to Fiona.
Sorry, yeah, I think cross-departmental governance within the UK government on the healthy homes agenda.
Thank you. Fiona?
Tackle social justice, make sure everybody has access to a decent home via a Healthy Homes Act.
Fantastic. Martina?
Fix the homes we have.
Fix the homes, yeah, absolutely. Ben?
We need to build more council houses.
More council houses. And a final word from Stephen.
Well, look, I'm the building safety minister. We've got to have a building safety revolution and ensure that we never have the crisis of Grenfell ever again. So that's what I'm focusing on.
Thank you so much to you all. I'm conscious that we've timed out, so that brings us to the end of our Healthy Homes discussion. We did cover an awful lot of ground there, so a big thank you to our panelists for such a diverse and engaging discussion. Thank you also to Velux and to the TCPA for partnering us with this for this event, and of course to our audience for sending through your questions. If you'd like to know more about Bright Blue or to become a member, do sign up on our website. We've been hosting 15 events this conference, and the next one is in half an hour on the green recovery, the jobs and goods of a post-COVID net zero economy. That's with Kwasi Kwarteng MP, so we hopefully see you for that as well. Thank you again for joining us, and enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.